started. Like last week, but hopefully with a little better technological support. To talk about politics this week, I am going to start out by giving you some ideas, some ways of thinking about politics and the relationship of politics to sport. And then I'm going to present you with a couple of cases that I hope we can talk about together where you can kind of try out some of those conceptual tools. First of all, though, I just want to shout out everybody who competed for the university this weekend. I know some of you are in here and did well in particular. A sport I think a lot of people maybe don't follow, but women's lacrosse is in its fourth season. As a program at Michigan. And this weekend they won their very first conference match, meaning the first time they won a conference game. And it was against Ohio State in the shoe. So congratulations. All right. So, you know, politics and sports has been in the news a lot in the last few years, in a way that it hasn't been for decades. This is one of the most notable examples, Colin Kaepernick kneeling or sitting during the national anthem that kind of sparked a wave of these kinds of protests last fall, and that sort of really accelerated even further through the presidential election season. And in the wake of the inauguration, we found athletes speaking out more frequently in public and sports journalists more often talking about political issues in their columns. And that has given rise to a kind of backlash where fans and others in the media are insisting that athletes and those who talk about sports just stick to sports. The idea of sticking to sports is a kind of long-standing one, actually, and it has several premises to it that I just want to quickly outline. One is that, sort of maybe pertaining to things like the Olympic movement, that governments should not meddle in sporting events. There shouldn't be boycotts and that kind of thing. The other is that athletes themselves should keep their political views private, that they shouldn't express themselves on political matters in public, that they have a great deal of influence, but that they really aren't qualified to make those kinds of statements, and that sports journalists, like I said, should confine themselves to reporting on the outcomes of events or the relevant storylines, those that are relevant to the competition itself. Obviously, this presupposes that it is possible to keep politics and sports separate, that it's better for them to be kept separate, assuming that they can be separated. And I want to just start out by questioning that presupposition to begin with, the idea that sports and politics can be separated. It depends a little bit on what you mean by politics, I think, and that is part of what I'm going to be pushing today in my remarks before we get to the case studies, is a slightly different way of thinking about politics than is usual in the United States in particular, and particularly within sports culture. Usually when people say stick to sports or keep politics out of sports, they are thinking of government specifically, and not thinking of politics in this kind of broader sense that I'm going to get to in a minute. But I want to just use one particular case right off the bat that I'm going to walk you through to illustrate the ways in which, even by a narrow definition of politics as the actions of government, sports and politics are already very mixed together. So this is a passage from Michigan Public Act number 414. So this is a state law in Michigan. You can see the section that I've highlighted. It says that an individual serving as a graduate student, research assistant, or in an equivalent position, or a student participating in intercollegiate athletics on behalf of a public university in this state, blah, 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 is not a public employee entitled to representation or collective bargaining rights under this act. So that was signed into law by Governor Snyder on December 30th. I think he signed it December 27th. It became law December 30th, 2014, all right? So Public Act number 414 started its life as House Bill 6074. It was introduced by Representative Al Sholka in early December of 2014. So the bill became a law December 30th. It was introduced as a bill December 2nd. So in 4 weeks, it went from bill to law. I'm not sure, how common that is, but it strikes me that that's pretty fast. House Bill 6074 was an amendment to an already existing act, Public Act 336, that was published became law in 1947, that was about regulating the ability of public employees to strike. All right? So in the process of that amendment, you can see the amendment on the right. This is taken straight from the bill as it was introduced. Okay, you can find these things online. You can see in bold caps the clauses that were introduced into Section 3, or it's like subsection 3 of Section 1 of the Act. It's the same language, and it made it all the way through. A few months after it was passed, the Michigan State Senate does an analysis of the bill, now act, now law, and expressly describes the purpose of it. The bill amended the Public Employment Relations Act to do the following: exclude from the definition of public employee a student participating in intercollegiate athletics on behalf of a public university. So you might be wondering why this bill would have been introduced and so rapidly become law in just a few weeks, in late 2014. So it probably had something to do with this. This is a New York Times article reporting on the effort by Northwestern University football players to establish a union at their university. Northwestern's a private university, as many of you know. They're governed by different labor relations laws than public institutions. In the case of a private university, employees need to petition to be certified by the National Labor Relations Board as employees, and therefore as entitled to form a union. And the regional board, a regional National Labor Relations Board in Chicago, decided that Northwestern players were employees. This was in March 2014, okay? So about eight months before House Bill 6074 was introduced in the Michigan House of Representatives. Interestingly, oh, whoops, I guess I didn't have a slide for that. I'm going to pull that back for a second. Just a couple months after this, the state legislature of Ohio, as part of a budget bill, also declared that athletes representing public universities in Ohio in intercollegiate athletics could not be considered employees. So you can see that already clearly that the government is having something to say about sports, right? And about the politics of sports. And that athletes themselves are intersecting with the government to try to claim certain kinds of rights, and some members of the government at least are pushing back on that right here in the state of Michigan. So the idea of sticking to sports or excluding politics strikes me as naive, and everything else I'm going to say from here on in today is going to kind of just take it as a given that sticking to sports, it's an option, but it's an option that entails a certain kind of naivete or a willful setting aside of certain realities, all right? Which, of course, people are entitled to do. Oh, one last detail about this that I find interesting, so I'm going to share it with you. The House bill in Michigan that was introduced, 6074, it was introduced to a House committee that reviews legislation, and the House committee is the Michigan Competitiveness Committee, which has to do with business competitiveness. In other words, it reviews legislation that is designed to make Michigan a more hospitable environment for businesses thinking about where to locate, okay? So things like tax breaks for businesses and so forth would be reviewed by the House Committee on Competitiveness. So it's interesting to me that this particular bill went through that particular committee because it suggests that it was viewed as an economic issue, which in a certain way, it's obvious labor relations are an economic issue, but we don't always recognize the ways in which sports and college sports in a place like Michigan or Ohio are significant economic engines. And so here is an effort in a certain way in this bill to keep labor costs down within the industry of college athletics. That's a way to think about this. Okay. So this whole discussion, I think, also kind of invites, for me anyway, the broader definition of politics that I want to turn to now. So I want you to think about politics broadly as a struggle to define the goals for a given community and also over the methods to be used to achieve those goals. And that struggle takes place in government, to be sure, and the case we just looked at is an instance of that sort of struggle. But it also takes place in everyday social interactions and in the forms of culture, that many of which we've already analyzed. Okay, so this basic definition is what I'm going to be working with. And I'm going to start out by just noting a couple of points. So here's your definition: as a struggle to define the goals for a given community and over the methods to be used to achieve those goals. I'm going to switch now to give you a sense of some of the assumptions and implications. So if it's a struggle, clearly it presumes that there may be differing and conflicting views on goals and methods. That's why there'd be a struggle. If there weren't any differences, there'd be no need to struggle. There'd simply be unanimity. That struggle, when you're talking about views and goals and methods, suggests that we're not just talking about a struggle over material resources, but also over ideas. That's really important for us in the humanities and when we are thinking about culture, because that's the terrain in which ideas get formed and shaped and changed. And then another thing that we need to consider is that it's possible that access to the resources needed to even participate in that struggle might be uneven, okay, or unequal. So before we get to the two cases, I want to run through two different ways. This is just a broad, somewhat oversimplified way of thinking of two different ways of being in that struggle. One I am going to call the way of power, and the other I'm going to call the way of autonomy. And I'm going to go through each of them, and then I'm going to give you a couple of cases so you can think about those dynamics and the interplay between the way of power and the way of autonomy in the cases that I share with you. Before getting to the way of power, I want to be clear. Power we tend to think of as an object, as a thing that somebody has. We can have it or somebody else can have it. We can maybe share it. But I'm thinking in different terms about power here. So I want you to try and set that idea of power as an object that you can possess aside. All right? Okay, so let's go and talk a little bit about the way of power first. All right? When I think of power in the sense that I'm using it, I'm thinking of power over, okay, as in power over others. And its aim is to control others. This is probably the closest we have to that idea of power as an object, okay? And the way of power and the attempt to control others, at least according to some people who analyze this stuff, works through 5 basic kind of mechanisms, all right? One we're not going to talk about too much today, but it's important to recognize it because it's so natural to us that we usually don't think of it as a thing. But the way of power establishes fear through a monopoly over the legal use of violence. Okay, so you think about the police, private security, the armed forces, right? All of whom can use physical violence legally in a way that nobody in this room can. Okay? And it doesn't necessarily mean you walk around in terror of these public entities. It just means that if you are considering an action and you are up against the edges of some law, one of the things you may be considering is what the other party may be able to do in terms of using violence. The other four factors are going to be more important, and I'm going to give you examples in sports, but one is control through confinement zones. Okay, what do I mean by a confinement zone? A school is a good example of a confinement zone. Okay? There are ways in which legally citizens are obligated to be in school up to a certain age, but even after that, ways in which social structures encourage that. And you can think of a school not just as a place where you get to learn and grow and acquire resources to fulfill your dreams, but also a place in which you are shaped and molded in a certain direction, in certain ways, right? And in a certain way made to conform, okay? Surveillance is another means by which the way of power works through hierarchical systems of observation. So these can be a lot of different things, but we've, I think, all seen or heard news reports in recent years about surveillance and the ways in which much of our private lives are in fact being watched and seen and monitored. And that may not affect any of us in this room ever in any direct way, but the surveillance is happening. Okay? And I'm not talking about like crazy shit like there's a camera in the ceiling right now that's like relaying everything that's going on in this room back to some like central control room or anything like that. I'm talking about what happens with algorithms on the internet, through social media, with metadata on phones, and so forth. That's all well documented. Norms through testing and examination. So this is how we establish what's normal and what is deviant, or what is excellent and what is deficient. And these are things that come up very clearly in sports, so that'll be easier for you to see when we get through the cases. And the last thing is the way that cultural forms and symbols tend to generate consent on the part of those over whom power is being exercised. Okay, so I'm talking about the ways in which, if, say, I were to suddenly say, you know what? You all have A's for this semester. What do you want to do? And some of you might like immediately get up and go find something else to do, and a bunch of you would sit here unsure. Some of you would sit here really wanting to learn more, and a bunch of you would sit here unsure about what to do with that freedom. Okay? That's because of a whole process you've been in for a couple decades now, some of you, by which forms of culture have generated in you a consent to my power over you that's wielded through the mechanism of testing and examination by way of grades. All right? All right, let's look at these in sports. Confinement zones in sports. Just a few examples. These really are off the top of my head. And it's going to involve defamiliarizing, making unfamiliar things that are pretty familiar to you, but usually not in this context. So to imagine your team as a confinement zone. Okay? Or a governing body. That gets a little bit easier. You think about the NCAA. We've talked a lot about that. Ways in which that's a confinement zone. Or a league can be a confinement zone. Right? That is an area through which you have to pass, okay, in order to do something that you want to do and that is controlled by someone else. That's the way to think about a confinement zone that can help you see the ways in which a team or a governing body or a league can work as confinement zones. It doesn't mean they don't also deliver benefits to you. If they didn't also deliver benefits, they would be kind of ineffective confinement zones. In effect, they'd be nothing more than prisons. And prisons are one form of confinement zone, but the more insidious forms of confinement zone are more subtle. The locker room, training facility, playing area, stadium or arena, also confinement zones. Areas through which you have to pass to do something you want that are controlled by someone else. The television set and the internet, we start getting into kind of symbolic confinement zones. I mean, television set is a material object, but what I'm talking about is the ways in which media can work as a confinement zone that is policed, owned by someone else. You may need to pass through it in a certain way, or you may wind up represented on it, but the ways in which you can behave in that venue are confined and determined by someone other than you. All right. Hierarchical observation in sports. So I think everybody in here who has played a sport or watched a sport has seen this in action. Somebody's watching who has authority over the athlete. Okay? It can be watching the quality of play or effort that's being put out by the athlete. It can be regulatory institutions watching behavior, referees obviously, but also officials of leagues and other governing bodies. The media and fans clearly are observing and watching. And then the self, the athlete, him or herself, could be, in a certain sense, observing themselves, partly with an eye that has internalized the methods of observation of coach and staff, regulatory institutions, and even the media and fans. All right. Testing to establish what's normal in sports, what's abnormal, what's competency, and what is deficiency. Physical exams, things like drug testing, okay? But also just things like being weighed, measured, body fat being quantified. All of those basic physical statistics, right? We just had the NFL Combine. That's a kind of classic, very blatant exhibition of this, right? Quantification of performance, I'm referring to the use of statistics and advanced statistics and biometrics devices to give a sense of whether athletes are performing at the level that is expected of them or not. Psychological testing for psychological fitness, but also more subtly for things like attitude and whether or not an athlete is going to be sort of a positive addition to the team chemistry. And then, of course, once again, the athletes themselves, to the degree that they do this, may establish their own norms and their own sets of internal tests and examinations by which they regulate themselves. So, the culture of consent in sports, we talked about this a lot last week, right? All the different ways that by its mediation through culture in the media, sports begins to generate consents to these forms of power that are exerted over athletes and fans and also just everyday citizens. The athlete as celebrity can present a certain kind of ideal or role model that one is encouraged to aspire to, or against which deviations are judged as a problem. The fan is a consumer where we are, in a certain sense, through our purchases, whether it's of viewing material or gear or whatever it might be, investing in the very system that is exerting power over us. And in a certain sense, our well-being is then tied to that system, right? Talking about, say, March Madness, for example. I love basketball. March Madness is a very exciting time of year for me. Every time I tune in, that's money in the NCAA's bank, right? And that's money that's not going to student athletes, at least not in a direct way, right? So if I consider that system to be unjust, my consumption as a fan is at the same time making me complicit with that system, okay? So I'm consenting to it, in effect, even if I protest it. And the way the media frames terms of thought and discussion, all these things are kind of interrelated. All right. So now I want to switch to the way of autonomy. This is simpler. Autonomy is, you can think of, if the way of power is power over, you can think of autonomy as power to, all right? it doesn't really concern itself primarily with the control of others. That may come up incidentally, but it is a desire, it comes from a desire to do certain things, to have the power to do certain things, okay? So that's, you can think of it as a kind of affirmation. Rather than thinking about dangers and how to fend them off or control them, one is thinking about what one wants and trying to enter into alliances that facilitate that. So that's what the first line under works by affirming, I'm referring there to a kind of exemption, a self-declared exemption from the dictates and methods of power. I'm not looking to create confinement zones when I am working with the way of autonomy. I am not looking to generate consent through cultural symbols necessarily, and so forth. Horizontal decision making rather than hierarchical decision making. Okay, it might just be involved. It might be as simple as walking into a classroom and saying, you know what, I'm the teacher, but, and I know I have the power of grades over you, but let's take that off the table. What do you want to do today? Let's decide this together. And maybe we spend the whole time just trying to figure out how to decide something together because we are so unused to that. Okay, that would be the way of autonomy. Direct action has to do with, it's also related to the last one, change in the present. Meaning you're not necessarily asking for anything, you are simply doing the thing. You are embodying with your actions the desire that you have. Okay? Rather than than alternatives, which aren't necessarily bad or something like that, but think about Colin Kaepernick, okay? He's thinking about he's not even thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement. He is thinking about black men being gunned down by police officers in this country, right? And there's a lot of ways he could respond to how that makes him feel. Of course, he can lobby Congress, he can start petitions, he can do all kinds of things. What he's doing is taking direct action. He's looking at where he's at. He wants to draw, his goal, his desire is to draw attention to an issue that's disturbing him, right? And so he finds this moment where he knows he's going to be on television, and so he takes an action. He doesn't know what's going to happen as a result of that action. He doesn't know whether it's going to change everything or change nothing, but he takes the action even given a state of uncertainty. That's an important part of the direct action. And then recognizing that whereas usually in the way of power, politics are considered to be rational actions from which you have to divorce emotion. In the way of autonomy, emotion is part of the equation. It is part of what gets factored. It is a part of desire. What you want, what you feel, what moves you is considered legitimate. A legitimate political concern, in other words, somebody suffering, is something you could be concerned about, and that's political. But also as a motivation and force. All right, I want to make sure we have time to get to these cases, so I want to do that. First, let me just see if you have any questions. I might not answer them because they might get answered through the cases, but any questions on any of these points so far? I can go back. Is it making sense? These two kind of broad ways. One that's sort of hierarchical, top-down, power, the way of power, or the way of autonomy that sort of springs from the bottom up. Okay. No? Questions? All right. Just a last way to think about the way of autonomy. And I know it seems kind of corny to put this up, but I really want to somehow impart to you that unlike the way of power, which is telling you to sit here and wait for somebody else, that power is out there somewhere, that Donald Trump has it, or that I have it, or anybody else. The way of autonomy is saying, it's right here, it's you. You do it. It's your life, it's your world, just like we talked about a few weeks ago. But now with respect to political issues, to that struggle over the goals for a given community and the resources used to achieve those goals. So, this is a still photo from a boxing match that took place in 1967 in February between Muhammad Ali and Ernie Terrell. It was a championship bout. Ali held one of the heavyweight championships titles. Terrell held the other one. And so this fight was scheduled to unify the heavyweight championship. It was scheduled for 15 rounds, and it went 15 rounds, after which Ali won a unanimous decision. This is February 6, 1967, in the Houston Astrodome. So the next couple slides are going to show you how this event was reported in the media following the fight. This is from Sports Illustrated. Cruel Ali with the skills, I don't know how much you can read of that, but a vindictive champion punished Ernie Terrell through 15 brutal rounds. This was from the New York Times after the fight. Cassius Clay demeans the heavyweight title. He has turned people's stomachs. There should not be an apostrophe on stomachs. Always teaching. This is from the New York Daily News. A disgusting exhibition of calculating cruelty, an open defiance of decency, sportsmanship, and all the tenets of right versus wrong. And from one of boxing's most celebrated journalists, Jimmy Cannon, writing in the New York Post, it was a bad fight, nasty with the evil of religious fanaticism. This wasn't an athletic contest. It was a kind of lynching. So keep in mind this language, all right? We're going to take a look at what happened, and we can begin to talk about these comments and how they relate to issues of politics, to the way of power and the way of autonomy. All right, let's see. This should start right up. You're going to see a clip from the fight.
Left hand is a defensive thing rather than a defensive weapon.
Exactly so. That's what Patterson did. Now he's hitting him again, much the way he did in the 7th round. Ali against Terrell. That's exactly, you'll remember what Patterson did to Johansson that June night, 1960, when he recaptured the heavyweight title. He nullified Johansson's right, and tonight Ali has nullified Terrell's left.
Clay is talking to Terrell. He's asking what his name is.
It said he'd humiliate him. I hardly think it's necessary. Don't you agree, Joe?
I don't know about that.
We have 30 seconds to go.
I think Clay can do what he wants to do in the ring.
Just happened in the ring. It spoke for itself.
Wait, how you see what Clay asked him? Said, what's my name?
That was the big 3-word question that was answered last Saturday on television in advance by Ernie Terrell.
Okay. So everybody saw what was happening, right? This was in the 8th round of the fight. Ali had already badly hurt Terrell the round before. Probably could have knocked him out, if not in this round, before the 15 rounds were up, but he didn't. He just kept hitting him, and in this round in particular is when he began to ask him, what's my name? Okay? I mean, ask him isn't really quite the word, but you get it. All right, so that's what was going on that led to the media commentaries that I was showing you earlier, all right? So why is Ali asking him, what's my name?
You continue to be unafraid of this man.
Yeah, I'd like to say something right here. You know, Cassius Clay, yes.
Why do you want to say Cassius Clay when Howard Cosell and everybody is calling you Muhammad Ali? Now, why you got to be the one of all people whose color to keep saying Cassius Clay?
Howard Cosell is not the one who's going to fight you. I am.
You making it really hard on yourself now.
Well,
Why don't you keep the thing in the sport angle? Why don't you call me my name, man?
well, what's your name? You told me your name was Cassius Clay a few
I
years
never
ago.
told you my name was Cassius Clay. My name is Muhammad Ali, and you will announce it right there in the center of that ring after the fight if you don't do it now.
For the benefit of this broadcast, him. All right?
You just acting just like an old Uncle Tom. Another Floyd Patterson. I'm gonna punish you.
Let me tell you something, man. You ain't got no
Back
business calling
off
me
of me.
Don't
Back
call
off
me
of
no
me.
Uncle Tom.
That's
man.
what you are, Uncle Tom.
Why you gonna call me Uncle Tom?
What
I
you
ain't do
gonna,
nothing.
you heard
Call
me.
no
Just
Uncle
back
Tom.
off of me.
And so, ladies and
Uncle
gentlemen,
Tom?
as the two contestants prepare for
Wait,
battle
what?
right now,
Back off of me, man. Back off of me, man.
another interview has been recorded for posterity as the two gentlemen continue to promote the fight.
Uncle Tom.
Perfect, that's it. Come on. Keep shooting.
You can promote the fight and all that stuff.
All right. So what do you think? Where are the politics in these two videos and in the media reports you saw? Where do you see the way of power or autonomy, if you do? Yeah.
Well, you can see the way of power in the fact that the announcer just wants to keep recording this altercation going on, whereas like Muhammad Ali is fighting for himself because he wants to be recognized as a human by someone like a same skin person. So and like that guy is going against his views.
Right. Okay, so the way of power, he's saying you could see in the interview and the way that Howard Cosell, the announcer, is kind of managing that interview, right, and wants to keep it rolling, even while these two black men are fighting and saying really hurtful things to each other, right? That's an important point, particularly when you think about the history of boxing in this country. Does anybody know where boxing in the United States began? It began on slave plantations, when owners of neighboring plantations would pit their male slaves against one another in boxing matches for money. So there's a really eerie kind of echo of that sort of brutal practice in the sort of smiling, almost gleeful facial expression of Howard Cosell as Muhammad Ali and Terrell begin to go at it in a pretty serious way during that press conference. So definitely, I see the way of power there. What are some other ways that people see it? Power or autonomy? Okay, so think about this. Think about the slave plantation, right? Probably you're familiar with the fact that slaves who already had names were given their names by plantation owners. Everybody familiar with that fact? Yeah? Okay. So Muhammad Ali, 3 years before this fight, had changed his name. Okay? He had become a Muslim, and for religious reasons, but also for political reasons, had changed his name from Cassius Clay, which was his given name at birth, to Muhammad Ali. Okay? So think about that. Think about just the name and this contest over the name. And what it means then, from the point of view of the way of autonomy, for Ali to be insisting that he has the right to give himself his own name. Okay? Does that make sense? As opposed to the way of power that gives a name to someone else. Okay? And now you think about Terrell's role in that. And his insistence 3 years after the fact on calling Ali Cassius Clay. Okay? So Ali could say, as he did in the press conference, why don't you call me by my name? And Terrell won't budge. He won't call him Muhammad Ali. He calls him, etc. And so then Ali takes direct action in the fight. He can't make him say, your name's Muhammad Ali, but he can act in a way that asserts his autonomy. Okay, so that's a way to think about the way of autonomy there. Right? You can see the way of power in the media backlash to Ali's performance, invoking ideas of sportsmanship and decency to kind of police Ali's behavior. Ali apparently crossed a line that exists in boxing, a line that says you shouldn't taunt your opponent, and if you can knock your opponent out, you should, right? Rather than torture him, which is the way that the media was characterizing it. That's the way of power. That's trying to enforce a norm of behavior, right? Establish certain parameters that say what's okay and what's not for an athlete in competition. And, you know, in the one passage, the one quotation, you could see the Jimmy Cannon quote from the New York Post, I think it was, that actually compared Ali's behavior to a lynching. Right? So you, I'm sure, are familiar with the history of lynching in this country and the kind of, I guess, I don't know what to call it, sort of disgusting irony involved in applying that term to this scenario. So that's an attempt to really powerfully whip up a certain kind of media consumer's view of a fight that most people didn't see. They just see the report in the newspaper the next day, right? And they see Ali portrayed this way. A couple months after this, Ali would be in jail for refusing to be drafted to fight in the Vietnam War, okay? And I'm going to just take 1 minute to read you. I think I have it here. Right, this is March 29th, 1967, so a month and a half after this fight. Here is what Ali did. He was drafted to fight in the Vietnam War. He refused to report to the draft board, and here's what he said. Why should they ask me to put on a uniform and go 10,000 miles from home and drop bombs and bullets on brown people in Vietnam, while so-called Negro people in Louisville, which is where he's from, are treated like dogs and denied simple human rights? No, I'm not going 10,000 miles from home to help murder and burn another poor nation simply to continue the domination of white slave masters over the darker people the world over. This is the day when such evils must come to an end. I have been warned that to take such a stand would cost me millions of dollars, but I have said it once and I will say it again. The real enemy of my people is here. I will not disgrace my religion, my people, or myself by becoming a tool to enslave those who are fighting for their own justice, freedom, and equality. If I thought the war was going to bring freedom and equality to 22 million of my people, they wouldn't have to draft me. I'd join tomorrow. I have nothing to lose by standing up for my beliefs, so I'll go to jail. So what? We've been in jail for 400 years. So from my point of view, that's the way of autonomy. Ali's not asking for anything. He's just making decisions in relation to the way of power. Okay? And he did go to jail, briefly, was bailed out, but he was stripped of his passport, stripped of his boxing title, lost 3 years of his boxing career and the potential earnings when he was at the prime of his abilities, okay, by that decision of conscience. Okay, I'm going to close with one more case that you are going to have been reading about for this week. This is from the 2006 World Cup final, France versus Italy. France will be in white. The French captain, Zinedine Zidane, who's number 10 in white, had already announced that he was going to retire before the World Cup. France made this run to the final. The final at this point is in overtime. And eventually, Italy won that World Cup on penalty kicks. Okay? So that's the basics of this one. Listen as well as watch.
Tony trying to settle it. Sends it back to Del Piero. Very quick. He has excellent wheels. Down he goes. And a handball there. They're going to quickly try and restart it, but a man is down for Italy as well here in the 109th minute. So Elizondo is back to take a look and calling for some attention. And he and Zidane have really been going at it. This happened away from the ball, so right now we're trying to get a look at who may be down.
Let's take a look here.
Oh,
Wow.
Marco Materazzi gets crushed by Zidane, and again away from the play, so Elizondo never saw that.
Elizondo's the referee.
And the referee didn't see, and he can't look at the scoreboard and then throw him out. He's got to rely on the two officials on the outside. If nobody saw it, doesn't matter what the camera picked up. FIFA can talk about it after the game, but the referee doesn't see it. He can't do anything about it.
Well, he'll be in trouble after the match, as you suggest, but not now. A vicious headbutt to the chest, driving Marco Materazzi to the deck. So this World Cup final has taken a nasty turn. Materazzi and Zidane have been going at it throughout the match.
The referee is going over to talk to the sideline judge.
Horacio Elizondo, his attentions were in another area of the field.
Obviously, he went over to the referee, right to the sideline official. He saw it and went and talked to him. Good referee. He saw it, the linesman saw it, talked to the official. He goes over and gives him a red card.
And he's out. Zidane, and that may be the end of it for one of the game's greats. You may never see him again. He has announced his retirement. Red carded and sent off. Surprising that he would take a chance like that at this point.
Disappointing to see something like this, especially from a player that's so classy. Here it is. They're going at it. They're talking. Let's see. He's going away. Nothing yet. Just a little chatting back and forth. And right there, he must have said something because he comes back and nails him like that. Wow, that's, you know what, that's disappointing to see a player at this level, such a classy player in his last game, do something like that.
A totally classless act by Zidane.
Classless act.
The captain. And a glittering career. Appears that this is how it will end. On a vicious driving head into the chest of Marco Materazzi. And that is all for Zidane. Sent off in a World Cup final in overtime. Malouda also a yellow card on Florent Malouda in the 111th minute. So Elizondo has been very busy working that pocket here in the overtime.
I know he did a nice job.
All right. So what did you see? This is not a hard question. What did you see? Huh? A flop? Okay. What else? Someone letting the emotion of a game getting the best of them. So is that what you think Zidane did? Like what do you imagine caused him to do that?
It was overtime. It was an incredible game. It was one of his last. He might have been frustrated and wanted to comment.
Okay, right. So that's a very understandable view of what you saw, given what information is given to you there, right? That it's a high-stakes game. It's the end of his career, high pressure. Maybe, you know, who knows, there's some shoving and holding going on, and he just loses it. Okay, here's what happened. The Italian defender said something to Zidane. In the days following this event, lip readers all over the world tried to figure out exactly what it was. Nobody's exactly sure to this day, but it was something like, son of a terrorist whore. All right? Zidane is Muslim. Originally, his family's from Algeria. Okay? So now it looks a little different, right? It's not just the emotion of the game, potentially. Or would you still say that?
I think you're still playing for your country and you need to allow comments that clearly was a malicious comment to get you to be frustrated. You won that side of the argument, not you.
Okay, so the idea, the counter-argument is he's still playing for his country, right? And whatever's said, you know, he has a kind of greater responsibility there than to his own honor or his family's honor or what have you. As you discuss this, if you do this week, I want you to think about how you might weigh those things, okay? What does it mean to play for your country, to be part of a country? Is everybody part of a country in the same way? Okay, those might be variations that make for a different decision in that moment on the part of Zidane. Okay, I got to let you roll.